Hi, students. Just want to say a few words about the Aryan controversy, which is key to the yoga dialogue in some important ways and some really unimportant ways. It's good to know about because it bears on current conversations in India, and these bleed into our discussion of yoga and the origins of yoga. So, to speak roughly, the Aryans are a group of, it's a culture and a language group, a language group that is associated with a certain culture which originated south of the Caspian Sea in the Caucasus Mountains. And it's a very, very complex story, but I'm going to tell it in a very simplified way. This group of nomadic peoples, this is a primary theory, who moved into a farming culture, and in that process spread a language form into Europe, which is to the west of that area of the Caucasus Mountains, and to the south into Persia, modern day Iran, and also into modern day Turkey, and to some degree down into the Levant, where we see the Semitic languages of the Jewish people and other similar cultures. And then, but more controversially, down into northwest India, what today we call Pakistan, but in the day that we are concerned with, for what was called the Indus-Sarasvati culture. When we say Iran, when we say Ireland, when we say Iraq, those words trace back to this idea, or this root culture, which we call the Aryans, and in old Sanskrit, what we call Vedic Sanskrit, which is one of our oldest Indo-European languages, which is the root system language for many, many European languages, Germanic languages, Latin languages, also the Persian language, and Hindi, modern day Hindi, and many of what we call the Prakrits, the languages that are rooted back to Sanskrit. So this culture obviously had a huge influence in its day, beginning about 4,000 years back, 4,500 years back before the current day. So it's a language group that's related to a culture that was a nomadic culture, which tamed the horse and therefore gained the access to chariots. This is a lot of what I'm saying is controversial and contended by certain classes of scholars. But the primary part of the story that we're concerned with is that it moved down into northwest India, current day Pakistan, and had a relationship with the Indus-Sarasvati culture. And it was probably a contentious relationship. The Indus-Sarasvati culture was declining around 2,000 years before the Common Era. By 1,200 years before the Common Era, it would be pretty much gone. And we can think of Rome in the 5th century of the Common Era when it was declining, and you had Vandals and Ostrogoths and other more vital nomadic tribes coming in and taking advantage of a declining but very old and sophisticated city culture. It looks like a similar thing happened in Mohenjo-Daro, or the Harappan culture. About 1,000, we've discovered about 1,000 sites where there were small or large cities, mainly along the Indus River and down along the coast into what we call Gujarat, which is northwest India. And these cultures declined as the Aryan culture rose, and eventually settled in the Gangetic Plain, which is, if you think of India as a diamond, that main diamond line where the Ganges River mostly flows, that's where a new city culture arose around 500 years before the Common Era. But an old culture, which is in the northwest, around Pakistan, declined as this vital, the barbarians always come from the north, as this vital culture came in from the north and composed the Vedas. The Vedas, around 1,200 years before the Common Era, the 4 primary books from which we get the main imprint of the set of Hindu ideas, set of Hindu language forms, which eventually became Sanskrit and was codified around 500 years before the Common Era. That culture which was probably light-skinned. We know that from evidence in the text, and encountered a darker skin culture. And that's partly why this is so contentious, because everybody says there's racism involved. But of course, racism has been perennial, and racism is involved because there was an oppressive system which was called Varna, which was attached to color, which eventually became caste. They conquered those people, and most likely, and there's probably, it happened over, you know, a period of perhaps 800 years, maybe more. And so some of these migrations could have been peaceful. Probably many of them were warlike, is what often happens when we have cultures meeting, which are contending over limited resources and are of different understandings. This is only logical to assume. So I guess that's kind of it in a nutshell, if that is all clear. A primary culture, which is a language form, which reformed the old Indo-European language, which is the root for modern Romantic languages, modern Germanic languages, the Persian language, and the Prakrit languages of India, moved out of a period of a area below the Caspian Sea, as many as 4,500, 5,000 years ago, spread out through kind of transportation forms and kind of an aggressive, probably warlike culture, and came into Northwest India and had a relationship, eventually blending actually with the Indo-European, or with the Indus-Sarasvati culture, picking up elements of it, because we see that in archaeology, which eventually fed into the larger picture of Hinduism today, and even gave us archaeological evidence of yoga in that period, what we call Pashupat seals, images of what very much clearly looks to be a yogi sitting in a yogic posture, and also small terracotta figurines in which figures seem to be in very basic yoga postures. So there's evidence in the Indus-Sarasvati culture for yogic forms. And then when we get to the Vedas, there are tapasic practices, heat building practices, which are kind of preambles to yoga, things like isolation, fasting, certain breathing practices, which prepared in those days the Aryans, which is what they call themselves in the Vedic text, for very complex rituals, a social approach to religiosity, not an individualized one, which is how we identify yoga, but that would come about 500 years later, about in what we call the axial age, from about 800 to 500 before the Common Era. So I hope that's helpful. There's also a reading attached to this video, and this kind of live explanation, I hope, enlightens it a bit and facilitates your reading. Thank you for listening. I'm Eric Shaw, signing off. Namaste.